Kenan Malik, shall I start questioning you now? You're the one. The Archbishop of Canterbury recently has said that there are many different mixed communities in this country now. There are groups of people with different beliefs. So in such a society with so many mixed group of people, there is no room for one law. And people should have different laws on that. What do you say about that?
Well, the first thing is that societies have always been plural. There's nothing new to plural societies. It's just that if you go back to, there's this perception that 19th century Britain was somehow a homogenous nation and suddenly we'd become very plural. Well, I'll tell you, if you go back to 19th century Britain, the cultural, political, social differences between a factory worker and a factory owner in 19th century Britain would be far greater than any cultural, social or political difference between, say, a 16-year-old child born of Pakistani parents who lives in Bradford and a 16-year-old white kid who lives in Bradford. So this idea that we're living in a more plural society, I'm sorry, it is simply that we perceive ourselves as living in a more plural society, and we perceive pluralism in cultural terms. In fact, the point is that every society, every community is deeply divided. So there's this notion that we live in a society which is full of, a multicultural society, which is kind of all these different cultures dancing around each other. But, you know, the argument about diversity somehow stops at the edge of those communities. Nobody imagines actually those communities, each of those are as divided as any other community. So there is no such thing as the Muslim community. There are lots of Muslim communities, lots of beliefs, attitudes, values, lifestyles within Muslim communities. And part of the problem is the very notion that has to be a certain set of rules and regulations that Muslims have to follow, and a certain relationship between, say, Muslim community and the state, and a certain relationship between the Sikh community and the state, a certain relationship between Hindu community and the state, imposes on those communities a viewpoint and a notion which most people in those communities simply do not hold. I mean, I know Yasmin says we don't want to go back, keep talking about Islam, and it's true, but Islam is actually a very good example in this, because if you take the Muslim Council of Britain, which until recently was seen as, you know, the voice of British Islam, every poll has shown about 3% of British Muslims think that it represents their views. And therefore, it is not that these different groups represent those communities. It is simply that politicians and states assume that certain community leaders represent those views of those communities. So there is no conflict between the idea that you should have one law for everyone and the fact that we live in a plural society. It's precisely because we do live in a plural society that we need one law for everyone. Because otherwise... Because otherwise, what you have is effectively apartheid, I mean, by any other name. Because every group is allowed to has its own laws and its own beliefs and its own lifestyle. And what you have is an apartheid system. We might not call it apartheid, we might call it multiculturalism, but that's just a fancy name for it.
Right. And one more question. That you mentioned the leaders. So-called religious leaders and all that, they have actually claimed that by having their own community, by having their own mosques, by having their own laws, by having their own courts, they help the youth to kind of balance into the society, integrate, and not join the terrorist organizations, the extreme organizations. What do you think? Is that any sense in that?
I don't feel unintegrated. I didn't need, most of the people I grew up with didn't need religious leaders to tell us how to be part of this society. In fact, it's the very opposite. It's interesting. When we talk about radical in the Islamic context, what most people mean these days means religiously fundamentalist. Well, when I was growing up, it meant the very opposite. It meant militantly secular. And we forget that there was a a strong militantly secular movement within Muslim communities, Asian communities, within all sorts of communities. And that's been squeezed out, largely because the state has accepted that very argument of religious leaders, that there is only one way of being Muslim, or one way of being Hindu, or one way of being Sikh. And so it has exactly the opposite effect, which is it has created a fragmentation to which it is supposedly a response.